So what it means to be pro-life has recently become much more complicated. Did you know that?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that anybody wants to think about it. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about it, but it's here. Until now, we haven't had to spend much time looking more deeply at the science and philosophy of what it means to be pro-life. Why? Because for decades, Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, and with abortion being legal, it was really like a much larger discussion of life versus death, not, oh, you're pro-life? What do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then your answer to that, we've discovered, may not be the same for followers of Jesus.
Yes.
And all of this comes out in the midst of an Alabama Supreme Court case that ties directly to in vitro fertilization. So I did find an interesting statistic before we get to the facts of the case. According to one survey, among those who are pro-life, who would identify as pro-life, which generally speaking, in the regular parlance, I believe they call it. Is that right?
I don't know.
Oh, they call it, I don't even know what I was saying.
So excited to celebrate your
Right.
word.
Word. But anyway, being pro-life would be beginning at conception. That's what people say. Conception,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Interestingly enough, 78% of people who identify as pro-life support in vitro fertilization. What do you think of that statistic? Are you surprised by it? 78% of people who are pro-life say, I'm in favor of in vitro fertilization.
That actually does surprise me,
Why?
because what happens to those unused embryos is horrific. People don't think about it. They may not realize it, but if you don't use those, they get locked in the freezer for decades.
Yeah, and I need to say as well, again, we've asked all of you to just give us some grace here as we talk about something controversial. We know that there are people listening this very moment who have participated in vitro fertilization, and we want to know we love you and care about you. I know people who've done it, and I love them and care about them. Okay? So this is not anyone judging your decisions. I'm saying at a philosophical level and a scientific level, this topic has become front and center for those who are pro-life.
Yeah. I think a lot of people viewed it from an overview, like the proverbial 30,000-foot view. And they're like, oh, well, IVF will help people who want to have children and can't physically have their own children to be able to do that.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I'm in favor of helping people to have children.
Right, yeah, it makes life. I love it.
Now, I have heard a way that other Christians have skirted the potential moral issue is they will only make the exact number that they plan to implant.
That is correct. And some will even do one,
Mhm.
which is excessively expensive, of course, for just one embryo. But I understand. So we're not judging your personal decision. I'm just saying I think a lot of Christians have never really had to think through this issue.
True.
So what is at stake? Well, all of it started back in about 2020 in a hospital in Mobile, Alabama. And there was a court case filed by 3 couples because what happened? I don't understand how this could happen.
3 times.
Well, a patient who's in the hospital somehow wanders into the room where embryos of people who are paying for the process of in vitro fertilization are being frozen inside of a freezer, okay? And it's a very cold freezer. Like, think you'd burn yourself from touching the
Right.
containers, okay? Patient wanders into this room. Okay, I don't know how that happens. Second of all, opens the freezer. I don't know how that happens. Picks up a tray, a container that contains embryos from 3 separate couples. As they touch it, it burns their hand because
Right.
it's at a very low temperature. And so they go, I burned my hand. What do you do when you burn your hand? When you have your hot potato, you drop it. They drop it on the floor, shatters, ruins the embryos. And so these
And that's like
couples,
thousands and thousands of dollars
Oh.
people have paid.
thousands of dollars, and hopes, dreams of people to have children.
And you don't know their physical condition. Perhaps they donated the egg and sperm to put that together before they might have had a disease that
Yeah.
would prevent that, or some
Chemo.
surgery, or yeah.
Yeah, and so if you put yourself in the shoes of the couples that experience this, there's so many levels of anger. It's like, how can you run a hospital and allow this to happen? That anyone can just wander in a room that has these things and open the freezer and just reach in and grab. I mean, I don't even understand how that's the thing. You'd be so upset. And then your hopes are dashed. You're angry.
Right.
Something should be done about this. In fact, immediately I would say to myself, there's got to be some kind of horrific negligence on the part of the hospital.
Oh, yeah.
It's at least 2 doors that should have been locked that weren't.
Yep.
Like, there's a cascade of problems with this hospital that allowed this to happen. And you trust the hospital when you're in this intense of a process
Right.
to protect you. And so these couples sued the hospital under a variety of theories. Like you kind of grab a whole bunch of ideas and here's a bunch of ways we're suing you because we want you to be punished so that this won't happen to anybody else, essentially, as I would imagine what their hearts were. And one of them was under an obscure law from the 1800s in Alabama about wrongful death of a minor.
Okay.
Okay. So, and here's what it is: the Alabama Supreme Court, this case works its way all the way up through the court system in the state of Alabama. We got to remember, there's a federal court system and a state court system, and in this case, it worked its way up the state court system. And often, once it reaches the state Supreme Court, depending on the type of case, it's over. Those cases don't often go to the U.S. Supreme Court because the job of the state Supreme Court is to be the one who interprets the law in that state.
Right.
The U.S. Supreme Court is not going to do anything about a state law. They interpret federal law. So the Alabama Supreme Court cited the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, while largely basing its ruling last month in this particular case on state law. The justices focused on an Alabama statute passed in 1872 that allows parents to sue for damages for the wrongful death of a minor child. Okay? In 2011, and so how could they do this? Because you're like, wait, it's a frozen embryo. Is that a minor child? That's the question, right?
Right.
So in 2011 and 2012, the court decided 2 cases that interpreted a minor child to apply to an unborn child. So previously the court had ruled, and jurisprudence becomes law,
Right.
that an unborn child is a minor child. Okay, so that immediately would apply. Yes, in 1872, that law, that applies to unborn children. But the question becomes, wait, is a frozen embryo an unborn child?
Right.
So that's what the court had to decide.
Because it could be like if you harmed a mother that's pregnant, she's 8 months pregnant, and then the baby that's in her womb dies. That would be an unborn child.
Right.
Correct. And that was the original intent,
Right.
obviously, in the 1870s. But in this case, earlier, a decade ago, the court expanded that in Alabama to say, oh, no, it includes unborn children. And so, blah, blah, blah. So the question before them now, the justices said, was whether to make an unwritten exception for extrauterine children. The answer was no. Responding to concerns about the future of IVF and in vitro fertilization in the state, they said it was not their role to craft a new limitation based on our view of what it is or is not wise public policy. So let me just narrow all that down. We have to remember in the American judicial system, it's the job of the courts to interpret the law. They do not legislate. Now, you can argue about whether they're doing that or not. It's not the point. They interpret the law that exists. And so it's the job of the state legislature to create laws. So what they're saying is, listen, we interpreted the law you made. If you want to say that this excludes in vitro fertilization, fine, that's your problem. You got to make a law that protects it then if you want to protect it. We just tell you what the law says. And according to this 1872 law and previous cases, an extrauterine child, a child frozen in a freezer, is a child.
Because it doesn't say otherwise.
Because it doesn't say otherwise.
Because it doesn't say extrauterine children wouldn't be protected.
Correct. And so suddenly, we in the pro-life movement who believe that life is made in the image of God are having to actually think deeply about, where 78% of people are like, oh, in vitro? Yeah, no problem. And yet now, personhood is being given to embryos frozen in a freezer. Now, I know many of you are like, well, yeah, duh, Brian. But it's complex. We're going to get to more of the complexity here as we continue talking about this sensitive subject. Again, just go easy Take a deep breath. We're not done talking about it yet. It's complicated, but I think the pro-life movement and followers of Jesus are going to have to answer some very difficult philosophical and scientific questions. If you're just joining us, we've been chatting about a controversial issue, and I'm just asking for your grace and your patience. We love the Lord. We believe that life is made in the image of God. And so we support life from womb to tomb. There's no question about that. But after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we talked about on the show a couple of years ago, Ron, about how I don't think people anticipated how complicated things are going to get because it's only been a larger pro or against abortion discussion for many decades.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have to really look at philosophy and science. So long story short, case in Alabama decided that personhood rights are extended to extrauterine children, as in frozen embryos being prepared for in vitro fertilization are babies, are people. And they have rights. Okay? So all that said, as the New York Times writes, the ruling vaulted the question of fetal personhood to the center of the debate that has followed the U.S. Supreme Court 2022 decision overturning Roe v. Wade. Until now, the post-Roe battle consisted of familiar clashes over how much to restrict access to abortion. Now, the framework has shifted. The Alabama court's decision made clear this stance on the definition of life can broadly rewrite reproductive rights and send states and perhaps the country down unpredictable paths. In response, Alabama legislators led by Republicans who have opposed abortion rushed to pass bills so that IVF can resume. The state legislature panicked. It was like, oh boy, we have to do this now.
Mm-hmm.
So they're trying to protect in vitro fertilization. Now, recognition of fetal personhood from the moment of conception has been a long-standing aim of leading conservative theorists, according to the New York Times. Do you think they're right about that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that phrase for ages, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, I don't know if you realize this. A lawyer for Americans United for Life called in vitro fertilization a form of eugenics.
I've heard that.
And the group Students for Life of America called it damaging and destructive. The Alliance Defending Freedom called Alabama's ruling a tremendous victory. As in, I think we don't realize that there is a core question about if you truly believe life begins at conception, can you support in vitro fertilization?
And why couldn't you? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so if you truly believe life begins at conception, and I'm not saying I do or don't, I'm having to think about this now, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's many ethical things that start coming in. So one of them is the science of it. Check this out. I went to the National Institutes of Health because one of the questions become, how often does conception happen? If you truly believe life begins when sperm fertilizes egg,
Right.
I think in our minds we go, that happens when you get a pregnancy test and it's positive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And this even gets more complicated. But all that to say, how often does that process happen? Because this is what we're talking about. Because inside of a freezer for in vitro fertilization, what you have is a sperm that has fertilized an egg. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So from various strands of evidence, it says at the National Institutes of Health, it's been calculated that in a normally cycling woman who's sexually active and not using contraception, conception will occur in about 85% of cycles.
Wow.
Of those fertilized eggs, around 15% will be lost before implantation begins. Of those which begin to implant, only about half will implant successfully. Of the half which do implant successfully, between 1/3 and 1/2 will be lost at the time of her period. Overall, therefore, around 75% of all conceptions are followed by a normal period. So, long story short, conception happens all the time and doesn't result in a baby.
And doesn't mean you're going to get a positive pregnancy test.
Mm-hmm. And so if you truly believe life begins at conception, in theory, right, there's a lot of grieving that would have to happen every cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a life that's been lost.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have to truly believe you've taken a baby and placed them in a freezer.
Mm-hmm.
That in and of itself, I don't know if anyone's ever talked about that or thought about it, right?
Right.
Would
Is
it,
that an ethical thing to do, is place a child in a freezer?
would it be because of the makeup of that child at the time? That's the only way for them to survive?
Yes, someone could say that, sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I think what we're going to be seeing now, I think and you guys can, this is where I want to kind of tap dance in the difficulty here. I think we may see a division begin because there's a lot of Christians who support in vitro fertilization and who have used it. God bless them, okay? I'm not saying they're good or bad here.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is I think we're going to see a split in what it means to be pro-life between those who believe life begins at conception and those who believe life begins at successful implantation.
Mm-hmm.
Am I crazy?
No, I don't think so.
No, it seems like those are two logical places where you might fall on the scale of where life begins. Some people would say life begins once the baby emerges from the womb. And that would be, another maybe logical but far-fetched view. I think most people agree that a child is alive in the mother's womb, but at what point is usually the question at hand.
And it's going to sound melodramatic, but in theory, if you really believe it's conception, and I'm challenging myself in this, if I really believe that, shouldn't I, anytime my wife and I are trying to have a child, and we're just going to leave it at that, shouldn't every time she has a period, we should have a series of funerals?
Yeah, unknown amount of lives were just lost in that case.
Or less dramatically so, grieve pretty dramatically. I know people who name their unborn children who they lose in that stage. How about this one? And this is where science gets so complicated. And we chatted about this as a team off air yesterday. There's a lot of Christians who are perfectly comfortable taking chemical birth control, as in, I'm talking birth control pill. You got IUDs. There's like arm implants, all those kind of things, right? I don't know if people realize this. What those do is prevent implantation. Am I wrong on this?
No, you're not wrong. They don't prevent fertilization, and a lot of people don't realize that.
Therefore, they don't prevent conception.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because conception, as I understand, is defined as sperm fertilizing egg, and it worked. That's conception.
They met, yeah.
So therefore, correct me if I'm wrong, morally and ethically, if someone believes life begins at conception, in some measure, they ought to be anti-chemical birth control and anti-in vitro fertilization.
If we're being consistent and honest with ourselves, then yes.
That's hard.
Yes, it is.
It is.
And I'm saying this out loud because a lot of people are not willing to say it out loud. And I'm just throwing it out there because I think we're going to be faced with this now, that Roe v. Wade is overturned. And there's battles about what life is and when it begins. And if you want to draw a line there, then it seems less rude that attorney for Americans United for Life called IVF a form of eugenics, where you're in a lab doing conception, picking your favorite one and putting it in a freezer. It's like, ugh.
And what's eugenics?
Eugenics is when you're sorting out which babies you want and getting rid of the ones you don't.
It's kind of like designer breeding with like dogs or horses, but we're doing it with humans.
Right. And so intellectually, it's consistent, right? If someone says you believe life begins at conception, you're almost required to call it something like eugenics.
Yeah.
Because if you're in a lab creating fertilized babies, if you're creating babies and you're picking the one you want, I mean, what else would it be than eugenics? This is hard, you guys. So, so I don't know. I guess we'd have to figure out, as followers of Jesus, we're going to have to decide: are we life begins at conception or life begins at successful implantation?
And why? One over versus the other.
Yeah, and what are the implications of that decision? Where does it lead us? I mean, if you truly believe in life begins at conception, then you'd only be able to use barrier methods of birth control or natural family planning. I mean, it changes a lot. Like
It does.
when Sarah and I first researched this before we had kids, she brought this up to a mom's group she was in. She had joined this group of other moms, and she brought up the idea that it allows for conception, like fertilization. And I just didn't even want to hear it.
They didn't want to hear it?
No, they were like, no, we don't want to talk about that. Because it would change entirely their method of preventing having children.
Yes.
a very sensitive, complicated issue. We're so grateful for your patience. Saw a nice text from someone thanking us for talking about this. If you're just tuning in, we're wrapping up a discussion now about a complex issue tied to human life. Human life is made in the image of God, and we support life from womb to tomb. And you know I'm choosing my words very carefully there, because in light of an Alabama court decision that we haven't talked about until today, suddenly personhood rights by a court have been extended to frozen embryos, extrauterine children. And I think it's forcing the pro-life movement to go, wait a minute, what do we believe? In so doing, if you're just tuning in, really it gets down to this very issue. Because conception happens so often naturally in the human body, the way God designed us. Like if you look up the science, we talked about it, 85% of pregnancy, of times a couple who is having sex and not protecting themselves in any way, 85% of the time conception happens.
I had no idea it was that great.
Yeah, lots of conception is passed in a period. Okay, lots of eggs.
A lot of couples, you know, try for a year or two before they're successful in having a pregnancy.
Correct.
And all that time they were successful in conception, but not successful in implantation, apparently, and onward.
Yeah, and so I think now you're seeing a debate among Christians who some surveys say 78% support in vitro fertilization. I don't know if they know what it is or have thought about it very deeply.
Right.
Because if you believe life begins at conception, you believe that those are babies being made in a little dish and put in a freezer. So the real question is going to become, and this is just my prediction, Christians are going to have to decide whether life begins at conception or successful implantation. So the next layer we're seeing some text messages come in. Anything you want to share yet? Or are we just going to keep rolling here?
Someone shared that birth control pills contain hormones, man-made hormones, estrogen and progestin, or progestin only. That's usually after, if like you're nursing or something, after you've had a baby. These hormones prevent pregnancy by stopping the release of a mature egg from women's ovaries. So it prevents ovulation, not necessarily implantation.
That's somewhat true. And again, if you look at the statistics, it's not always true. It doesn't totally prevent ovulation.
Yeah,
Not
there's
every
some.
time.
Yeah, there's some women who still do. Yeah.
And so again, if you believe life begins at conception, you're not totally preventing that by taking chemical preventative medicines.
And then someone asked about condoms, and that would just be the difference of.
It's a barrier method.
Yeah.
Not 100% though, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
They're not 100% effective. So do you think it's a legitimate, just philosophically speaking, this is the hard part of it. Do you think it's a legitimate position to believe life begins at implantation as this debate develops? Because it will.
I think so.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly when a soul is granted to a developing child, but if you just look at a sonogram, like they seem to have some sort of personality. So because we don't know that, we don't know when God has gifted life with a soul, and it does seem to be alive. Like we know that that is some sort of life because we call a bacterium a life. I do think that it's valid to call it a life.
And so, see, I have this odd obsession with intellectual consistency. It's annoying. It annoys me. But I'm somebody who would go based on this line of discussion. Quite literally, if you believe life begins at conception, you cannot support in vitro fertilization. And you cannot support chemical means of preventing pregnancy.
And why can't you?
Because conception will happen.
Okay.
And a life will be lost.
So what's the problem of IVF? Is that some of them you're not going to use?
Yeah, like what do you do with the leftovers is one basic question. But even I think conceptually, would it be moral, biblical for someone to go, I believe this is a human life, open the freezer, I'm putting it in? Now, I know it's complicated, but there's got to be some moral, ethical challenge there of freezing them at all, let alone saying, what do we do with the extras? Now, again, there are ways where you can do it, where you can just fertilize one. I understand all that. I'm just saying, I think the intellectually consistent position would be if you believe life begins at conception, you don't believe in any sort of chemical prevention of pregnancy, and you can't support IVF. It compels you into a new group, which the new group would be you believe life begins at successful implantation.
Yeah, but then why?
Yeah, well, and then what does that do with embryonic stem cell research? Like, there's so many levels of this. Like, I don't know. So then suddenly you have to be okay with that as long as it's not implanted?
Hmm.
Ah!
Yeah, and then I guess the question with IVF, so maybe you just do one. So if you'd like to think to do it in an ethical way, you just have one embryo. You don't have multiples. So then you're knowingly putting it in your body that it may not survive.
Yeah, that's an ethical problem. But again, now I'm suddenly realizing if you believe life begins at successful implantation, you really are opening up the door to embryonic stem cell research. And you should have to go, yeah, no problem, go for it. Because that's not a baby. Because it's not implanted.
But you just said if you do subscribe to implantation being.
Yeah, if you say it's not a life till it's implanted, embryonic stem
So
cell
then you would
research can
say,
happen in the lab.
I got it.
Yeah, so you'd be like, oh yeah, great, go for it. Or not go for it, but at least you'd have to be intellectually consistent. You'd have to say, yeah, I guess I don't have a problem with that then. Or maybe you come up with a new reason not to be okay with it. Like, it just seems weird.
Yeah. And at what point are we coming up with something that is comfortable for our life view and not necessarily true to the facts of science and God's word?
What do we do, Ron? You've been around the longest.
Take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. My head hurts just trying to think about this. I've always been, just kind of well, of course, life begins at conception because that's what Americans United for Life or any of the other pro-life groups, has said. So I just,
Me too, Ron.
follow lockstep with them. And now I'm thinking, okay, how does that necessarily mean that, Scripture doesn't delve into the psychological intricacies that we're faced with today? And I don't know that it really says all that much about when life begins.
Well,
although it does say, like, if a pregnant person is injured and you lose the baby, you're compensated as if it were alive. So life begins before birth.
Well, and somebody could be charged with murder, by the way, of 2 people if the mother and the child dies, or just the child. You can be charged with murder. We've been comfortable with that.
Yeah.
So does that mean then if this Alabama law, which extends personhood rights to extrauterine children, does that mean the guy that wandered in there and opened the freezer can be charged with murder?
And how many counts?
Right. It could be multiple counts of 3 couples.
Very least manslaughter, which, I mean,
Spend the rest of his life in prison.
For all of them, yeah.
I think it's a discussion worth having. And I think it depends on if he knew what he was doing and why he was in there.
Yeah, I think it's something we bring to the Lord.
It was just a random person. Sorry, let me just clarify.
Yeah.
It wasn't
a
like
patient in the hospital.
It wasn't in a hospital employee or anything?
No.
Gracious.
That's why it's so odd. I mean, the person very well could have been suffering from some sort of disorientation.
That's what I was wondering.
Like, I can't imagine it'd be something malicious there.
But nonetheless, getting into that room should have required a badge or some key sort. And then the equipment shouldn't have been, I mean, he got into there easier than Dennis got into Jurassic Park's holding cell. And Dennis ran the thing.
Dennis. And he put it in the shaving cream, that guy.
Yeah.
Boy, I tell you what, I think it's something, again, you gotta seek the Lord on these things, seek the scriptures, read them deeply. Because again, I don't say it lightly. I take it seriously, the responsibility as an ambassador for Christ. We need to be ambassadors for Christ in all that we do. And so I think we need to be consistent in what we say Scripture teaches and how we live out our lives. And this is one that I wish I didn't have to think about. Honestly.
I know.
I mean, more married couples that are following Christ, I think, need to think about issues like this.
Yeah, I mean, when you said it was, 78% or something like that Christians thought it was fine?
Yeah.
That's not surprising to me because of how much IVF I've seen in the church.
Yeah, and again, we're not judging you if you've done it. I think there is a line of logic where you could support that. I'm sure there is, because you've done it. But
yeah, I think maybe we've just used, if you're okay with IVF, We've just used the term life begins at conception because it's an easy thing to say and not necessarily
Right.
because we really know what we're saying.
It's like a slogan.
Yeah.
Yes.
But did we really think about what it meant?
Yeah. Or even if we do really believe that, do we actually believe it starts at conception, or do we believe it starts at implantation? We just never have thought about it.
We got a really interesting text earlier in the morning that some Christians are pro-life when it's convenient for them. Like when abortion was the main thing, it was easy to say, oh, only irresponsible people do that. Well, now there's something that is staring all of us in the face as far as our everyday choices.
Because for someone who firmly believes in conception, it could mean a broken heart that believes morally they can't participate in vitro fertilization.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because they're confronted with the reality of it. And you know, it's so complex that I've told the whole story on the air before, but my wife almost died from a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. And guess what that is? It's a fertilized egg that has implanted itself in the wrong place, in a fallopian tube, not the uterus. It can't survive, can't thrive, will cause the death of both the baby and the mother. Guess what the treatment is for that?
An abortion.
Yes, a chemical abortion. You give a drug to make sure that the fertilized egg is passed. If not, it ruptures and you die. Like my wife's ruptured in the hospital, gratefully, where she was rescued by emergency surgery. But you see, was that a baby?
Yeah, and like, oh, so you just let it rupture and hope that you get to the hospital to have an emergency surgery?
And that's where we were confronted with that, Lauren, when we were sitting there and the doctor came in and very carefully said, well, it's an ectopic pregnancy. We're going to give you a shot and it will pass the egg. Sarah and I looked at each other like a deer in the headlights. Oh, no. What do we do?
Yeah, with miscarriages, sometimes if your body doesn't pass it, you have to get an abortion to get it out.
Yes. It's a lot to grapple with. We ask that you prayerfully seek the Lord in this, talk to your family and friends. I think we're going to have answers to this.
Yeah, and we're going to keep talking about it. We have some people coming on later in the month.
Yeah, we have somebody from the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity that's going to talk more deeply about this. And this is just the beginning. We don't have answers right now, but I think we have to have the conversation. We'll be the ones to raise our hands and say, okay, we'll start.
Yeah.
Now you continue.